There is a very quiet assumption hidden inside the phrase, "I need someone to feel whole." It sounds tender, reasonable, even poetic, as if wholeness were a state you could misplace, like a glove left on a bus, and another person might be kind enough to return it to you. The sentence doesn't sound dramatic. It sounds honest, and that is precisely why it so rarely gets questioned. The assumption is not that companionship is pleasant. That is obvious enough. The assumption is that without someone, something essential is missing. That the self, left alone, is incomplete by definition. That there is a kind of human arithmetic at work. 1 + 1 equals something more real than one alone. And because this arithmetic feels emotionally convincing, it quietly becomes a rule, a background truth we stop noticing. Yet when you watch something that is not human, this rule begins to wobble. Watch a tree standing in an empty field, not a symbolic tree, just a tree. It is not waiting for another tree to arrive so it can finally become itself. It is not rehearsing a future where its roots will feel justified. It grows, bends, breaks sometimes, adapts to wind and drought and seasons, without consulting the idea of completeness at all. Not because it has solved a philosophical problem, but because the problem never arose. Or watch a cat lying in a patch of sunlight, not performing solitude, not being independent as a virtue, simply existing, fully absorbed in warmth, breath, sensation. The cat is not half a cat until another cat enters the room. It does not experience itself as a fragment in search of completion. It is not that the cat rejects connection. It simply doesn't use connection as proof of existence. Now, when we notice this, the usual reaction is to say, yes, but humans are different. And of course we are. We tell stories. We remember. We imagine futures. We compare what is happening with what should be happening. But notice how quickly that explanation slips past something more interesting. It explains that we feel incomplete, but not why incompleteness feels like a problem that must be solved by another person. So let's stay with the feeling itself for a moment, without trying to fix it. The feeling of not being whole rarely arrives as a clear thought. It arrives as a subtle tension, and the less we insist on being complete, the more seamless experience becomes. Not perfect, not resolved, just uninterrupted. So the problem with needing someone to feel whole was never really about the other person. It was about mistaking a feeling of focus for a state of being, mistaking reflection for existence, mistaking relief for truth. And once that mistake is seen, not condemned, not corrected, it gently loses its grip. What remains is not an answer, but a different posture toward experience, one that allows connection to be connection, and aloneness to be aloneness, without forcing either to carry the weight of defining who you are. And in that looseness, life doesn't suddenly make sense. It simply continues, less burdened by the need to arrive anywhere else. Time feels provisional. The present feels like a waiting room. And the future, populated by someone imagined but not yet here, starts to glow with meaning the present seems to lack. This is where the metaphor quietly enters, often without announcement. The self begins to behave like a container, a vessel with a visible gap, and the other person, partner, lover, soulmate, even friend, becomes imagined as the missing substance. The thing that will fill the shape, make it stable, make it stop leaking unease. And because this metaphor operates below language, it doesn't feel like an idea at all. It feels like reality. But containers are peculiar things. Once you see yourself as one, everything that happens is interpreted in terms of filling or emptying. Attention becomes nourishment. Absence becomes loss. Distance becomes danger. And the other person, without ever agreeing to the role, becomes responsible for maintaining your internal equilibrium, not through cruelty or demand, but through presence alone. This is where the problem begins, though not yet in an obvious way. At first, the arrangement seems to work. Being with someone brings relief. the background noise quiets. The edges feel less sharp, and because relief feels like truth, the mind concludes it has found the answer. This, it says, is what I was missing. But relief is not the same thing as wholeness. Relief is a change in tension, not a discovery of essence. And when relief gets mistaken for completion, dependence quietly sneaks in wearing the costume of love. Identity begins to reorganize itself around the relationship, not dramatically, not with declarations, but through small adjustments. Decisions are filtered, emotions are calibrated, the sense of self slowly leans outward, like a building supported by a neighboring wall. And as long as that wall remains, the structure feels stable, even stronger than before. But stability borrowed from outside is fragile in a particular way, not because it will necessarily disappear, but because it might, and the mere possibility of loss introduces a new layer of tension. The wholeness now depends on conditions. Presence must be maintained. Attention must continue. The future must cooperate. This is when anxiety quietly enters the room, not as panic, but as vigilance. You begin to listen for changes in tone, to read silences, to wonder what something meant, not because the other person is doing something wrong, but because your sense of being complete has become contingent. The self is no longer simply happening. It is being monitored, maintained, protected. And the strange thing is, none of this feels like a mistake while it's happening. It feels like care. It feels like attachment. It feels human. Yet underneath it all is still that original assumption, humming softly. Alone is not enough. We rarely stop to ask where this assumption came from. Not in a historical sense, or a cultural one, but experientially. When did the self first start feeling like a fragment? Was it ever actually whole and then broken? Or was wholeness something we were taught to imagine, the way we're taught to imagine a straight line as more correct than a curve? Because if you look closely, the sense of incompleteness does not come from being alone. It comes from thinking about being alone in a particular way. It comes from comparing the present self to an image of a future self with someone and finding the present wanting. The discomfort is not solitude itself. It is the story told about solitude. And stories, once believed, have consequences. So perhaps the question is not whether needing someone is wrong or right. That already sets up a judgment that misses the point. The quieter question is this: what happens to the experience of being alive when wholeness is postponed? When the self is treated as a draft, awaiting final approval from another's presence? We can sit with that question without answering it. Just notice how often the sense of me tightens or loosens based on who is nearby, who is absent, who might arrive. Notice how the feeling of being real seems to fluctuate with connection. Not as a failure, but as a pattern. And from here, without rushing, something begins to come into view. Not a solution, not a correction. Just a subtle curiosity about whether the self was ever meant to be completed in the first place. If we stay with that curiosity, not trying to resolve it, not trying to turn it into a lesson, something interesting begins to happen. The question softens. It stops asking for an answer and starts acting more like a lens. And through that lens, the whole idea of wholeness starts to look less solid than it first appeared. Because notice how strange the word itself is. Whole. It suggests an outline, a boundary, something that can be completed, closed, sealed. We imagine a circle that finally connects back to itself. No gaps, no openings, no unfinished edges. And we treat that image as if it were a natural description of a human being, rather than a metaphor we quietly inherited. But lived experience doesn't feel like a sealed shape. It feels more like a flow. Thoughts arise and dissolve. Moods shift without asking permission. The sense of me drifts from moment to moment, confident one minute, uncertain the next, deeply present now, oddly absent later. There is no fixed object you can point to and say, that is the complete self. There is only an ongoing event. And yet, The mind prefers objects to events. Objects feel manageable. You can define them, possess them, improve them. So the self gets treated like an object, something that ought to have a stable form, and when it doesn't, the gap feels like a problem. Something must be missing. This is where the search for another person quietly takes on a new role, not just companionship, but definition. Being seen by someone can feel like snapping into focus. Their attention acts like a mirror, reflecting an image of you that feels coherent. You feel more solid, more real. And again, this is not an illusion in the sense of being false. The experience is genuine. The feeling of solidity truly arises. But the mistake comes when that feeling is taken as evidence that the solidity originates from the other person. It's as if awareness, momentarily stabilized by relationship, gets misattributed. This is who I am because you are here. The mirror gets mistaken for the source. And because mirrors can move, turn away, or disappear, the stability they provide is never guaranteed. So the self begins to hover slightly, always adjusting its posture to stay reflected. This is subtle. It doesn't announce itself as fear. It announces itself as effort, as care, as the constant, quiet management of connection. You begin to notice how much of your inner life is oriented toward maintaining a certain image of togetherness. Not because you're pretending, but because the relationship has become the place where the sense of coherence lives. Without it, the self feels blurred, unfinished, oddly transparent. This is often described as losing yourself in someone, but that phrase is misleading. Nothing was lost, something was relocated. The center of gravity shifted outward. Identity leaned into relationship and learned to balance there, and balance, once learned, becomes necessary. So the absence of the other doesn't just bring loneliness, it brings disorientation. A strange sense that the internal compass no longer works. Decisions feel heavier. Time stretches. Even simple moments feel less anchored. Not because the world has changed, but because the reference point has moved. And here's where the tension deepens. Because now the relationship is doing two jobs at once. It is a space of connection, intimacy, shared experience, and it is also a structural support for the self. And those two functions are not the same. They can coexist for a while, but they pull in different directions. One asks for openness, fluidity, mutual presence. The other asks for reliability, predictability, reassurance. When the other person simply lives their life, distracted, distant, preoccupied, changing, the part of you that leans on them feels threatened. Not emotionally threatened in a dramatic sense, but existentially unsettled. The ground feels less firm, and so the mind begins to interpret ordinary fluctuations as signs. Messages. Warnings. This is how anxiety disguises itself as attentiveness. You become very good at noticing shifts, a shorter reply, a delayed response, a different tone, and each shift is measured against an unspoken question. Am I still whole here? The question doesn't appear as words. It appears as a tightening in the chest, a loop of thought, a need to check, clarify, restore balance. And the more the relationship is asked to provide wholeness, the less room there is for it to simply be what it is. A meeting of two changing processes. It starts to carry weight it was never meant to bear. Not because the other person is inadequate, but because no external structure can permanently stabilize something that is, by nature, fluid. What's fascinating is that this tension often increases with closeness, not distance. The more meaningful the relationship becomes, the more it seems to confirm its role as the missing piece. And confirmation strengthens the assumption. The assumption strengthens dependence, and dependence sharpens the fear of loss. All of this unfolds without anyone doing anything wrong, which brings us back, gently, to that original assumption. That aloneness equals incompleteness. That the self, left to itself, is insufficient, because if that assumption weren't there, The movements of relationship would still matter, but they wouldn't define the structure of the self. So perhaps the discomfort isn't pointing to a missing person at all. Perhaps it's pointing to a misunderstanding about what a self is supposed to be. Not a closed system, waiting to be finished, but an open process, already in motion, already expressing itself, with or without accompaniment. We don't need to turn that thought into a conclusion. We can simply let it hover. Notice how strange it feels. Notice how unfamiliar. And notice how the mind wants either to reject it or turn it into advice. We can resist both impulses. Just stay with the sense that something about wholeness may have been framed incorrectly from the start. If we let that sense linger, the possibility that wholeness was never meant to be assembled, another layer of the experience begins to reveal itself. Not through argument, but through attention. Because once the self stops being treated as a project, the feeling of incompleteness starts to change its character. It no longer feels like a whole. It feels more like movement. What we often call missing something is, on closer inspection, a kind of restlessness, a subtle inability to settle into the immediacy of experience without referencing something else. The mind keeps leaning forward or sideways, toward a person imagined, remembered, or anticipated. And in that leaning, the present moment feels thin, provisional, as though it were only a corridor leading somewhere more substantial. This is why needing someone can feel so compelling. Another person anchors attention. Conversation, touch, shared routines. These pull awareness into a narrower channel. The mind quiets because it has something specific to orbit. And again, this quiet feels like resolution. But it is the quiet of focus, not the quiet of completion. Think of how concentration works. When you're absorbed in a task, the usual background noise disappears, doubts recede, time compresses. You feel more yourself. Not because the task completed you, but because attention stopped scattering. Relationship can function in exactly the same way. It gathers the mind, and gathered mind feels like solidity. But what happens when attention is not gathered by another? It spreads, it wanders, it turns back on itself. And that wandering is often interpreted as a problem rather than a natural movement. The mind says, something is wrong, I should feel more anchored than this. And once again, the anchor is imagined as external. This is where identity begins to tighten. Instead of experiencing oneself as a shifting field of sensations, thoughts, and feelings, the self becomes an idea that must be stabilized. Who I am starts to feel fragile, in need of reinforcement. And reinforcement, conveniently, arrives through reflection, through being wanted, chosen, prioritized. So the relationship quietly becomes a kind of evidence. Evidence that you exist in a meaningful way, that you matter, that your presence registers. Without it, the self feels oddly transparent, as though it could pass through the world without leaving a mark. But notice how peculiar that fear is. It assumes that meaning must be confirmed from the outside. That experience alone is insufficient proof of existence. That being alive is not quite enough unless it is witnessed in a particular way. And yet, experience continues regardless of whether it is mirrored. Breath happens. Sensations arise. Thoughts appear uninvited. The body responds to light, sound, temperature. Life is undeniably occurring. But because it doesn't arrive with a label or a witness, the mind discounts it. It feels too ordinary, too unmarked. And ordinariness, in a culture obsessed with significance, gets mistaken for emptiness. So the need for someone becomes entangled with the need to feel significant, not in an egoic, boastful sense, but in a very quiet, human one. The need to feel that one's existence is anchored to something solid, something that doesn't drift. The difficulty is that nothing in experience doesn't drift. People change, feelings change, circumstances change, even the sense of me changes from moment to moment. So when wholeness is outsourced to something inherently fluid, the effort to hold on becomes constant, subtle, but exhausting. This is often where control sneaks in, not as domination, but as management. You start managing expectations, communication, emotional climates, trying to keep the relationship aligned with the role it has unconsciously been given. And the more important that role becomes, the more anxious its maintenance feels. Yet underneath all of this, there is a quieter truth trying to surface. One that doesn't announce itself loudly because it doesn't offer drama or rescue. The self was never actually broken. It was only imagined as an object that could be completed, and once that imagination loosens, even slightly, the need to be made whole by another begins to soften. Not disappear. Soften. Lose some of its urgency. Aloneness starts to feel different, not as a verdict, but as a condition, like silence between sounds, like space between thoughts. Still unfamiliar, sometimes uncomfortable, but no longer automatically interpreted as failure. And from here, something subtle becomes possible. Relationship can return to being what it was before it was asked to finish the self. A meeting. An exchange. A shared unfolding. No longer a solution, but an experience. This doesn't make connection less meaningful, it makes it less heavy. And the strange thing is, when the weight lifts, intimacy often deepens. Not because the other person completes you, but because neither of you is being asked to. We don't need to push this any further. The point is not to arrive anywhere, just to notice how the feeling of incompleteness changes when it is no longer treated as a defect, but as a movement of attention, a habit of interpretation. From here, we can simply watch how often the mind reaches outward to feel real, and how often reality is already happening without that reach. And if we stay with that watching, not trying to correct it, not trying to transcend it, the whole pattern begins to feel less personal, less like your issue or your attachment style, and more like a common human reflex. A reflex of consciousness trying to stabilize itself by holding on to something that appears steady. Because the need to feel whole through another is not born from deficiency. It is born from uncertainty. From the simple fact that awareness does not come with edges. It doesn't announce where it begins or ends, and that lack of clear boundary can feel unsettling. So the mind reaches for outlines, roles, relationships, names. I am this because I am with you. In that sense, the other person functions like a contour drawn around water. The water didn't need the shape to exist, but once the shape appears, the water seems more recognizable, more graspable. And when the shape disappears, the water hasn't vanished, it has only lost its outline. What we often mourn, then, is not the loss of the other, but the loss of definition, the sudden return to formlessness, to a self that feels harder to point to, harder to explain. And explanation is something the mind deeply prefers. This is why being alone after strong attachment can feel disorienting in a way that goes beyond loneliness. It's not just the absence of shared moments. It's the absence of a familiar reference point. The quiet question that arises is not only, where are you? But, who am I now in this shape? And again, notice how that question assumes that identity must take a particular shape at all. When the self is no longer being reflected, it starts to feel transparent, and transparency is often mistaken for emptiness. But transparency is not absence. It is openness. It is the lack of obstruction, the lack of a fixed image standing in the way of immediate experience. In transparency, there is less narrative reinforcement, fewer echoes of, "This is who I am." And without those echoes, experience feels raw, unbuffered, sometimes quiet, sometimes unsettling, but also oddly intimate in a different way, intimate with sensation, with time, with the simple fact of being here. This is the part of the experience that rarely gets named, because it doesn't fit the usual language of relationships or selfhood. It isn't independence. It isn't self-sufficiency. Those are still identities, still shapes. This is more like the absence of the demand to be shaped at all. From here, the need for someone doesn't disappear. Desire still arises. Connection still matters. Affection still warms the nervous system. None of that is denied. But it no longer carries the same existential urgency. It no longer feels like a rescue operation. Someone can be wanted without being required to complete the picture. And when that happens, something curious occurs in everyday life. Time feels less like a waiting room. Moments don't feel like placeholders. Even longing, when it arises, feels less like a verdict and more like a passing weather pattern. It moves through rather than defining the landscape. Work still happens. People still come and go. Loss still hurts. But the sense that life is somehow on hold until the right person arrives begins to loosen. Not because a better belief replaces it, but because the belief itself stops feeling necessary. You may notice that when you stop insisting on wholeness, experience feels less fragmented. Not more dramatic. Not more meaningful in a grand sense. Just more continuous. Less interrupted by the question of whether it is enough. And perhaps that is the quiet irony running through all of this. The more we chase wholeness, the more divided